Ask anyone what a map is and they will tell you it is a picture of the world. An accurate, objective record of where things are. Coastlines, mountains, rivers, borders. The neutral language of geography rendered onto paper or screen. Something you trust without thinking about it, the way you trust a ruler to tell you how long something is. That is exactly what the people who made maps wanted you to believe. Because maps have almost never been neutral. Not in ancient Babylon, not in medieval Europe, not in the colonial era, and not today. Every map ever made was a choice. A deliberate decision about what to show, what to leave out, where to put the center of the world, whose territory counts as a country and whose gets absorbed into someone else's empire without a label, without a border, without a name. Maps are not pictures of the world. Maps are arguments about the world. And for most of human history, the people making those arguments were kings, priests, generals, and colonial administrators who had very specific reasons for drawing the world the way they did. The history of cartography, the history of mapmaking, is one of the most revealing stories in all of human civilization. Because when you look at who made the maps, when they made them, what they chose to include, and what they chose to erase, you stop seeing an innocent technical record and start seeing something far more interesting. You start seeing power. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The oldest known map in human history was not of a trade route. It was not of a coastline or a river valley or an empire's borders. It was of the night sky. The Lascaux cave paintings in southwestern France, created by Paleolithic humans roughly 17,000 years ago, contain a cluster of dots that archaeologists now believe represent the Pleiades star cluster. A separate arrangement matches the position of stars in the constellation Taurus. These are not accidental arrangements. They are deliberate spatial records of astronomical observations, painted on cave walls by people who needed to track the seasons, predict animal migrations, and organize time itself. Mapping preceded writing by thousands of years. Before humans developed a system for recording language, they were recording space. The relationship between things in the world and how to navigate between them. The oldest known terrestrial map, meaning a map of actual landscape rather than sky, is a clay tablet discovered at a site called Erasure in ancient Mesopotamia, in what is now northern Iraq, dating to approximately 2300 BCE. It is small enough to fit in your palm. Scratched onto a piece of hardened clay in cuneiform script are two mountain ranges, a river flowing between them, a delta opening toward what appears to be the sea, and markings indicating cardinal directions. Archaeologists believe it depicts a river valley in the region of the Euphrates, though the exact location is still debated. Around the edges of the landscape is a circle of water, labeled in the cuneiform text as the Salt Sea, the edge of the known world. That detail matters enormously and we will come back to it. Because the very first terrestrial map ever made already contained a built-in assumption about where the world ended. Already contained an editorial decision about what lay at the center and what lay at the periphery. Already contained a worldview, not just a landscape. And that pattern, the map as worldview rather than the map, as neutral record, would define cartography for the next 4,000 years. In 1882, a British archaeologist named Hormuzd Rassam excavating the ruins of ancient Babylon in modern-day Iraq uncovered something that would take scholars decades to fully understand. It was a clay tablet, roughly 6 inches across, covered in cuneiform inscriptions and marked with a circular diagram. At the center of the circle was a dot labeled Babylon. Surrounding it in a ring was a body of water labeled the Bitter River, the Salt Sea encircling the known world. Beyond that ring were triangular shapes pointing outward into what the text described as distant, mythological regions. Regions beyond the known world, where monsters lived, where the sun was not visible, where the laws of ordinary reality did not apply. The Babylonian world map, as it came to be known, dates to approximately 600 BCE, though it was likely copied from an even older original. It now sits in the British Museum in London, which is its own quiet irony that we will address shortly. The map is not particularly accurate by any modern cartographic standard. Its geography is schematic rather than precise. Babylon is vastly oversized relative to every other location. The surrounding regions taper off into myth rather than continuing into what we now know was a world full of other sophisticated civilizations. But accuracy was not the point. The point was cosmological and political. Placing Babylon at the literal center of the world was not a mistake or a limitation of geographic knowledge. It was a theological claim and an imperial assertion. Babylon was the center of the world because the Babylonian state apparatus needed its citizens, its tributaries, and its neighbors to understand that Babylon was the center of the world. The map was propaganda in clay. This is the fundamental thing most people do not understand about ancient cartography. Maps were not made to help ordinary people navigate. Ordinary people navigated by landmarks, by rivers, by stars, by accumulated local knowledge passed down through generations without anything resembling a drawn map. Ancient maps were made to project power, to define territory, to establish that the person controlling the map was the person who understood the world, and therefore the person qualified to rule it. If the Babylonians put Babylon at the center of a flat disk, the Greeks did something genuinely revolutionary. They figured out the earth was round. Not because of some sudden flash of inspiration, but through the painstaking accumulation of observational evidence. Sailors noticed that ships disappeared hull-first over the horizon, with the mast visible long after the deck had vanished, which only makes sense on a curved surface. Travelers moving north or south noticed that different stars became visible, indicating they were seeing around a curve. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BCE, listed multiple pieces of evidence for a spherical Earth, including the circular shadow Earth casts on the moon during lunar eclipses. But the achievement that still stops modern scientists cold belongs to a man named Eratosthenes of Cyrene, a Greek scholar working as chief librarian at the legendary Library of Alexandria in Egypt around 240 BCE. Eratosthenes had heard that in the city of Syene in southern Egypt, at noon on the summer solstice, the sun shone directly down a deep well with no shadow visible on the walls. The sun was perfectly overhead. He also knew that in Alexandria, on the same day at the same time, vertical objects cast a measurable shadow. Using basic geometry, he calculated that the difference in the sun's angle between the two cities was approximately 7.2 degrees, which is 1/50th of a full circle. He then obtained an estimate of the distance between Alexandria and Syene and multiplied by 50. His result was 252,000 stadia. Converting that ancient Greek unit of measurement to modern equivalents gives a figure somewhere between 39,000 and 46,000 kilometers for the circumference of the Earth. The actual figure is 40,075 kilometers. A man with a stick, a well, and a rudimentary knowledge of geometry calculated the size of a planet he could not see the edge of, to within a few percentage points of the correct answer, more than 2,000 years ago. This should have changed everything. And in the Greek intellectual world, it did. Greek geographers, building on Eratosthenes, began developing coordinate systems, drawing lines of latitude and longitude, and conceptualizing the world as a sphere that could be systematically measured and mapped. The most ambitious product of this tradition was the work of Claudius Ptolemy, a Greek mathematician and geographer working in Alexandria around 150 CE. His 8-volume work, Geographia, contained a world map and detailed instructions for projecting a spherical world onto a flat surface, something cartographers still wrestle with today. His map covered the known world from Ireland in the northwest to Southeast Asia in the east, and included thousands of place names with their estimated coordinates. Ptolemy's Geographia had two significant problems. His estimate of the Earth's circumference was substantially smaller than Eratosthenes' more accurate calculation. And his knowledge of Asia was based on travelers' accounts and merchant reports that compressed the actual size of the continent considerably. These two errors together meant that on a Ptolemaic map, the distance from Western Europe westward to Asia appeared to be a manageable ocean crossing. 14 centuries later, a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus used a Ptolemaic-derived map to argue to the Spanish crown that sailing west from Spain to reach Asia was entirely feasible. He was not accidentally wrong about where Asia was. He was wrong because the best available map was wrong. And the consequences of that wrong map reshaped the entire world. If you are finding this genuinely surprising, go ahead and subscribe. We pull apart the history that everyone thinks they know and find out what is actually underneath. New video every day. Between the decline of Greek geographical science and the eventual recovery of Ptolemy's work in Western Europe, roughly 1,000 years passed during which European cartography took a dramatic turn away from geographic accuracy and toward something else entirely. Medieval European mapmakers produced documents called Mappa Mundi, Latin for cloth of the world. The most famous surviving example, the Hereford Mappa Mundi, was created in England around 1300 CE and is now displayed in Hereford Cathedral. It is approximately 1.6 meters tall and roughly 1.3 meters wide, drawn on a single sheet of calfskin vellum and ink, paint, and gold leaf. It is also deeply, systematically inaccurate as a geographic document. Britain, the country where it was made, is shown as a small distorted peninsula in the upper left corner. The Mediterranean is recognizable but severely distorted. Asia takes up roughly half the entire map. Jerusalem sits at the exact center, surrounded by a circular ocean that marks the edge of the known world. At the very top of the map, above Asia, is the Garden of Eden, depicted as a circular island with the 4 rivers of paradise flowing outward from it. Around the edges of the known landmasses are illustrations of the wonders and monsters believed to inhabit the world's distant regions. Blemmies, creatures without heads who had their faces in their chests. Cyopods, one-legged beings who used their enormous single foot as a parasol against the sun. Dog-headed humans. Giants. Serpents of extraordinary size. To a modern eye, the Hereford Mappamundi looks like a failure of geographic knowledge dressed up in elaborate illustration. But that reading misses the point entirely. The Mappamundi was not trying to be a navigational chart. It was a theological document, a visual encyclopedia of the Christian world order. Jerusalem at the center was not a geographic claim. It was a cosmological one. The world radiates outward from the site of Christ's crucifixion. Because theologically, all of human history radiates outward from that event. Eden at the top was not a geographic location. It was the beginning of time, placed at the top of the map because in medieval European convention, east was oriented upward, and east was where the sun rose and where paradise was believed to lie. This is why we use the word orientation to mean finding your position and direction. It derives from oriens, the Latin word for east, because orienting a map originally meant aligning it with east at the top. The monsters at the edges were not artistic decoration. They were theological information. The margins of the known world, in medieval Christian cosmology, were where order gave way to chaos, where God's civilization faded into the wilderness of the uncivilized. Every creature at the edge of the Hereford map was a visual argument that the Christian European world at the center was defined precisely by not being those things. The map was not wrong. It was a different kind of right. It was mapping meaning rather than geography. But the people who would eventually use maps as tools of empire were about to weaponize the same impulse, the impulse to put yourself at the center and push everything unfamiliar to the margins, in ways that would prove catastrophically consequential for millions of people across the globe. The 15th century changed cartography forever. And not, as it is usually taught, because Europeans suddenly became curious about the world. They became acquisitive about the world. There is a difference. The Portuguese crown began funding systematic exploration of the African coastline beginning in the 1420s under Prince Henry, called the Navigator not because he sailed but because he organized sailors who did. The goal was commercial and imperial from the outset: find a sea route to the spice markets of Asia that bypassed the Muslim-controlled overland trade routes, establish fortified trading posts along the way, and extract as much wealth as possible from every territory encountered. Maps were instruments of this project from the very beginning. And critically, maps were classified state secrets. The Portuguese maintained what historians call the Padrão, a master map of their known navigational discoveries, kept under lock and key at the royal court in Lisbon. Sea captains returning from voyages were required to submit their charts and observations to the royal cartographers, who incorporated the new information into the master map. Unauthorized disclosure of the Padrão's contents was punishable by death. Rival European powers would pay enormous sums for access to Portuguese charts. Cartographic espionage was a real and serious profession. Geographic knowledge was power in the most literal sense. The nation that knew where the coastlines were, where the safe harbors lay, where the currents ran, and where the profitable resources could be found was the nation positioned to control the trade routes, establish the colonies, and dominate the global economy. Maps were the intelligence documents of empire. When Columbus returned from his first voyage in 1493, the Spanish and Portuguese crowns went directly to the Pope to have the newly discovered territories divided between them by papal decree. The result was the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which drew a vertical line through the Atlantic Ocean at a specific longitude and assigned everything west of the line to Spain and everything east of it to Portugal. Think about what that line actually was. Two European kingdoms, with the blessing of the head of the European Church, sat down and drew a line on a map and agreed that everything on one side of an imaginary mark belonged to one of them and everything on the other side belonged to the other. The existing inhabitants of those territories, tens of millions of people across two continents they had not yet even fully explored, were not consulted. They were not present. They did not know the line existed. The Treaty of Tordesillas is perhaps the most consequential line ever drawn on a map. And it was drawn by people who had not seen most of the territory they were dividing, using cartographic information that was partially wrong, to assert ownership over people and places they had no legitimate claim to. It is the map as imperial instrument in its purest form. In 1569, a Flemish cartographer named Gerardus Mercator published a world map that solved a critical navigational problem and simultaneously distorted global geography in a way that still shapes how most people alive today picture the world. Mercator's challenge was practical. Sailors needed a map on which a constant compass bearing could be plotted as a straight line. On a globe, a constant compass bearing follows a curved path called a rhumb. No flat map could show the whole globe as a globe. Something had to give. Mercator's solution was a projection system that stretched the map progressively as you moved away from the equator. At the equator, the scale is roughly correct. At higher latitudes, the distortion increases dramatically. Land masses near the poles are stretched horizontally and vertically to maintain the property that compass bearings appear as straight lines. The result was a navigational tool of genuine brilliance. Sailors could plot their courses with unprecedented ease. The Mercator projection saved lives at sea and made transoceanic navigation substantially more reliable. It also made Greenland appear to be roughly the same size as Africa. Greenland's actual area is approximately 2.2 million square kilometers. Africa's actual area is approximately 30.4 million square kilometers. Africa is nearly 14 times larger than Greenland. On a standard Mercator projection map, they appear comparable in size. Europe, located in the northern latitudes where the projection inflates landmasses, appears substantially larger than it actually is relative to equatorial regions. The United States looks roughly comparable to Africa. South America, which is nearly twice the size of Europe, looks smaller on most Mercator maps. Alaska looks larger than Mexico when Mexico is actually larger than Alaska. These distortions were not Mercator's secret agenda. He designed the projection for navigational use and understood its limitations. The problem was that within a century of its publication, the Mercator projection had become the default world map used in schools, government offices, and atlases across Europe. It became not a specialized navigational tool but the standard representation of the world itself. And the countries inflated by that representation, the European nations and their North American colonies sitting in the latitudes where the projection adds size, were precisely the countries that would dominate global affairs for the next 4 centuries. Children in European schools looked at a map every day that showed their continent as disproportionately large in Africa, Asia, and South America as proportionally diminished. They absorbed a visual representation of relative importance that had nothing to do with reality. In 1973, a German historian and filmmaker named Arno Peters published a new projection specifically designed to show landmasses at their correct relative areas. The Peters projection, later refined into the Gull-Peters projection, looks deeply strange to anyone raised on Mercator maps. Africa is enormous. South America dwarfs Europe. Greenland shrinks back to its actual modest dimensions. The reaction from professional cartographers was mostly hostile. The arguments against the Peters projection were largely technical and had some merit. But underneath the technical objections was something more uncomfortable. People who had spent their entire lives looking at Mercator maps found the corrected version profoundly wrong-feeling. Which reveals the exact nature of the problem. The distorted map had become so normalized that the accurate map felt like the distortion. We had confused the map with the world. And we had done it for 400 years. The most violent use of maps in human history did not involve guns or armies directly. It involved names. When European colonial powers mapped the territories they claimed in Africa, Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific, they did not simply record the geography. They renamed it. They applied European place names to locations that already had names, often names with deep historical, cultural, and spiritual significance to the people who had lived there for generations or millennia. Bombay over Mumbai. Rhodesia over Zimbabwe. The Gold Coast. The Ivory Coast. The Slave Coast. Those last 3 names tell you exactly what European cartographers saw when they looked at the African coastline. Not communities of people with their own political structures, histories, and names. Resources. Commodities. Things to be extracted. The interior of Africa on European maps was labeled terra incognita, unknown territory, well into the 19th century. Unknown to Europeans. Thoroughly known to the tens of millions of Africans who lived there, traded across it, built kingdoms and cities and road networks on it. The label unknown territory was not a geographic statement. It was a political statement. It meant unmapped by us, unclaimed by us, not yet incorporated into our system of property and sovereignty. An unmapped territory, in colonial logic, was available territory. The doctrine of terra nullius, the legal principle that land belonging to people who had not developed it according to European standards was legally unoccupied and therefore available for colonial appropriation, depended entirely on maps that showed indigenous territories as blank space. Australia was declared terra nullius when the British arrived in 1788. The map showed nothing. The map was lying. There were approximately 300,000 Aboriginal Australians living on the continent, organized into hundreds of distinct language groups, with sophisticated land management practices developed over 60,000 years of continuous habitation. Terra nullius as applied to Australia was not overturned until 1992 by the Australian High Court in the Mabwa decision, which recognised for the first time in Australian law that Aboriginal Australians had existing legal rights to their land. The map had taken 200 years to partially correct. In 1884 and 1885, representatives of 14 European nations gathered in Berlin for a conference convened by the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. No African leaders were invited. No African voices were present. Over the course of several months, the representatives divided the African continent among themselves, drawing borders that would define the political geography of Africa for the next century and beyond. The Berlin Conference borders were drawn with rulers, following straight lines of latitude and longitude or rivers chosen for their cartographic convenience rather than their correspondence to any existing human geography on the ground. They cut directly through the territories of hundreds of ethnic groups, split linguistic communities in half, separated peoples who had long histories of cooperation and trade, and forced together peoples who had no shared history, language, or political tradition. The British administrator Lord Salisbury, describing the process, said with remarkable candor that the powers had been engaged in drawing lines upon maps where no white man's foot has ever trod. They were not mapping what existed. They were creating what would exist, by the act of drawing it and then enforcing the drawing with military power. Those borders, the straight lines and geometric divisions of the scramble for Africa, remain almost entirely intact today. When African colonies became independent nations throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the new governments largely kept the colonial borders rather than attempting to redraw them, because redrawing borders meant wars and because the international community, dominated by the same Western powers that had drawn the colonial borders, provided no mechanism for peacefully renegotiating them. The ethnic conflicts, civil wars, and political instabilities that have characterized parts of post-colonial Africa are not evidence of African incapacity for self-governance, which is what European commentators at the time and since have often implied. They are the predictable consequence of forcing incompatible groups inside artificial borders and then withdrawing the colonial administration that had held the artificial structure together by force. The map made the wound. The wound did not make itself. The maps on your phone look different from the Babylonian world map and the Hereford Mappa Mundi. They are assembled from satellite imagery, GPS data, and sophisticated computer algorithms. They update in real time. They are accurate to within meters. But they are not neutral. Google Maps, which an estimated 1 billion people use every month, makes editorial choices constantly. It chooses which roads to prioritize, which businesses to feature, which neighborhoods to represent in detail. In areas of contested sovereignty, it shows different maps to users in different countries. The borders between India and Pakistan look different depending on whether you open Google Maps in India or in Pakistan. The territory of Crimea appears as part of Ukraine on maps displayed in the United States and Europe, and as part of Russia on maps displayed in Russia. The map changes based on who is looking. This is not a new problem. It is the oldest problem in cartography. The map reflects the interests and assumptions of whoever controls the mapping. What has changed is the scale. A medieval English monk drawing a map in Hereford affected the worldview of the people who saw that one object. Google's cartographic choices affect the worldview of a billion people simultaneously. And there is a subtler issue embedded in digital mapping that is worth sitting with for a moment. When you navigate with Google Maps or Apple Maps or any digital mapping tool, you follow a route chosen by an algorithm. You do not read a landscape and make decisions. You follow instructions. The embodied geographic knowledge, the accumulated understanding of a place that comes from moving through it with attention and memory, is replaced by step-by-step instructions that require no understanding of the underlying space whatsoever. You can navigate to a destination perfectly efficiently and arrive there with no idea where you are, how you got there, or what lies in any direction beyond the route you were given. Indigenous geographic knowledge systems, accumulated over thousands of years of intimate engagement with specific landscapes, were systematically dismissed and erased by colonial cartography. The same process is now underway in miniature within all of us. The algorithm is replacing the accumulated local knowledge that previous generations carried in their bodies, in their memories, in the stories embedded in the names they gave to places. A river that floods every spring has a name in the language of the people who have lived beside it for 2,000 years, and that name contains information about the flooding. A mountain pass that is dangerous in winter has a name that encodes the danger. When colonial cartographers renamed these places in European languages, that embedded information was lost. When digital algorithms replace the local knowledge of people who have navigated an area their whole lives, the same kind of erasure happens at a smaller scale. The map still shapes what we know and do not know. The map still decides who is at the center and who is at the margin. The map is still an argument, not a mirror. Every map you encounter is worth a second look. Not just a glance to find where you are going, but an actual critical reading. Ask who made it, and when, and why. Ask what is at the center and why that is at the center. Ask what is at the edges and what assumptions that placement reflects. Ask what is labeled and what is left blank. Ask whose names are used for the places shown, and whether those were the first names or the replacement names. A map that shows national borders as fixed, permanent, obvious features of the world is making an argument that national borders are natural. They are not natural. Every border on every current world map was drawn by a specific person at a specific historical moment for specific political reasons. The border between the United States and Mexico was established by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, following a war in which the United States seized roughly half of Mexico's territory. The line drawn in that treaty is shown on maps today as if it has always been there, as if it is as natural as the Rio Grande that follows part of its course. The map flattens history into geography. It shows you where things are without telling you how they got there. And the how they got there is almost always more important than the where. Because when you understand how a border came to be, you understand that it could have been different. And if it could have been different, it can be different. Maps that look permanent are always provisional. History keeps revising them. The border of the Roman Empire at its greatest extent in 117 CE looked like a permanent geographic fact to the Romans living within it. That border is now invisible on any map, crossed by tourists and truck drivers without ceremony 100,000 times a day. The border between East and West Germany was built in concrete and wire and guarded with lethal force. It was gone in 1989. Maps show us where we are. They do not show us where we are going. And they almost never show us the choices and violences and contingencies that put us where we are. There is a moment in the history of cartography that stands as a quiet counter-argument to everything we have discussed. In 1972, the crew of Apollo 17 took a photograph of the Earth from approximately 45,000 kilometers out. It became known as the Blue Marble, one of the most reproduced photographs in human history. It shows the Earth from the south. Antarctica is at the top. Africa and the Arabian Peninsula are clearly visible. The Indian Ocean dominates the lower portion of the frame. North America is barely visible in the upper left. When the photograph was reproduced in most Western publications, it was rotated. North was put at the top, where maps trained people to expect it. The south-oriented original was quietly corrected to match the conventional assumption. But for a moment, in the original photograph, the world had no correct orientation. No center. No margin. No labeled territories. No borders drawn by rulers in 1884. No terra nullius. No papal line dividing the Americas between Spain and Portugal. Just a sphere in the dark. Every map since the first clay tablet has been someone's argument about how to see that sphere. About who matters and where the center is and whose territory is real and whose is blank space waiting to be claimed. The Blue Marble was the first image to show the world with no argument attached. We rotated it within days. That tells you everything you need to know about the history of maps, and about us. If this changed the way you look at the next map you see, there is another story on screen right now that pulls apart a different piece of received history and finds out what is actually underneath.